I have run that morning back through my mind 10,000 times, and it always begins the same way, with the small warmth of my son's hand leaving mine, and me not noticing it go. That is the part that still wakes me. Not the road, not the wheels, not the sound the whole forecourt made. The leaving of his hand. He was 2 years and 4 months old, and his fingers had been curled around two of mine the way they always were, and I was answering a question someone in our little group had asked about the changing of the watch, and somewhere in the middle of my own clever answer his hand simply was not there anymore. I went on talking. For 11 seconds, by the reckoning I made later, I went on talking to grown people about a thing none of us would remember, while my son walked away from me toward the busiest edge of the palace forecourt. His name is Davy. I will tell you the whole of it, because I made a promise to a man who would not let me thank him, and the only way I have found to keep it is to tell people exactly what he did, and exactly what it cost him to be able to do it. We had come up to the city for my sister's wedding, a family of plain river country people in our good coats, and on the free morning we had walked the long way round to see the palace gates the way everyone does. There were a dozen of us, aunts and cousins and my wife's mother, and that is the danger nobody warns you about. A child with one parent is watched by one parent. A child with 12 relatives is watched by no one, because each of the 12 is certain one of the other 11 has him. We stood at the broad, cobbled forecourt inside the outer rail, where the tourists gather and the phones come up and the soldiers in the red coats and the tall black furs stand their posts like something carved. I had Davy's hand. Then I was talking. Then I had cold air. The forecourt is bigger than it looks in pictures. It runs from the gatehouse arch across a great apron of pale cobbles toward the inner ground, and along the far side of it, beyond a low chain swag on iron posts, the service way comes through, the way the drays and the household carts and the coal wagons use, because a palace eats and burns and is mended like any great house, only more so. There is a working road inside the postcard. The tourists never look at it. Children, it turns out, look at nothing else because there are horses on it. That is where he went, toward the horses. I know now, from the soldier and from 2 other people who saw more of it than I did, the shape of the next half-minute, and I will lay it out plainly, because the truth of it matters more than the way my own panic remembers it. There were 2 great dray horses being walked across the head of the serviceway that morning, bay geldings, broad as doors, drawing an empty flat wagon back toward the stable yard after the morning delivery. A boy was at their heads and a carter on the seat, and they were doing nothing wrong. They were doing the oldest right thing in the world, bringing horses home. They came at a walk. But a loaded answer to a delivery had backed up behind them, and a second wagon was coming down the slope of the service way at a brisker pace than it should have, the driver of it craning to see why the road ahead had stopped. So you had the 2 big bays at a walk across the open mouth of the way, and behind and above them, dropping down the slope, a second wagon with a driver looking the wrong direction. And into that mouth, out from under the chain swag, which is at exactly the height to be a doorway for a person 2 feet and a half tall, walked my son, toward the nearest horse's foreleg, with both arms up, the way he reached up to be lifted, because to Davy a horse was simply a very large and wonderful dog who had not yet been told to come and be petted. I have asked myself what I would have done if I had turned a second sooner. I think I would have done the human thing, which is the wrong thing. I would have screamed his name and run flat at him across 40 feet of cobbles. And he would have heard his father's voice cracked open with terror, and he would have done what frightened small children do, which is freeze and then bolt. And a bolting child under a dropping wagon is the thing I cannot let myself finish thinking about. Even now, even with him asleep down the hall this very night, 11 years old and too big to carry. I did not turn a second sooner. I turned at 11 seconds, and the whole forecourt was already moving, and there was a red coat in the middle of it where no red coat is ever supposed to be. The guard at that post stood, as they all stand, on a low square stone, a little way out from the wall, beside the head of the service way, near enough to the chain swag that he was the closest of all of them to the mouth of the road. I had looked at him twice that morning the way you look at the soldiers, as a thing to photograph, a man who would not move if you shouted in his face, and I had thought, God forgive me. I had thought what everybody thinks, which is that he was barely a person at all, just discipline poured into a uniform and stood up in the sun. I want to tell you exactly what those men are trained to do, because I did not understand it until that morning, and now I understand it better than I understand almost anything. They are trained not to move. Not for a shout, not for an insult, not for a flash in the face, not for a hand waved an inch from their eyes. The not moving is the whole of the work. It is a discipline 100 small men test for sport every single day, and the guard eats every test and stands. He is not permitted to leave his post. The post is a sacred thing. The post is the kingdom. A man who steps off his post on a whim is a man who cannot be trusted to hold a wall when holding the wall is hard. Everything in him, everything they have built into him over years says, you do not move. He moved. I did not see the first half of it. The man who told me the first half of it was a foreman of the stable yard named Crail, a square gray man who had been walking up the service way and saw the whole thing from the inside. He said the guard's head had already turned. He said, and he said it like a man describing something he still could not quite believe a person could do, that the soldier was looking at the child a full 2 seconds before anyone made a sound, because the soldier had been doing the one thing none of the rest of us were doing. He had been watching the road, not the tourists, not the phones, not the loud family in good coats. The mouth of the working way where the horses were, where the danger always is. Crail said the soldier had marked Davy the instant he ducked under the chain, had read, in the time it takes to draw one breath, the child, the upstretched arms, the near horse's foreleg, the second wagon dropping down the slope, and had made in that same breath the calculation that the rest of us would not finish making until it was far too late. That there was no time to call, no time for anyone else, no time for the right and lawful thing, which was to summon and to wait. So he spent the thing he was forbidden to spend. He spent the post. He came off the stone in one stride. Crail said he did not run the way a frightened man runs, all heat and noise. He ran the way a thing is launched, low and flat and silent and committed, the rifle going to one hand and then to the ground, because a rifle is not what this needs, the white glove already out. I have watched since, what film there is of it. There is always film now, and the thing that undoes me every time is how little wasted motion there is. He does not waste 1/100th of a second on the horror of it, the way I would have. He simply solves it. He crosses the open ground between his post and my son in a time that the people who measure these things told me was under 3 seconds, and he reaches the child a half stride before the near horse's shoulder comes round, and he does not snatch. That is the part Crail kept coming back to. The part I have come to think is the whole soul of it. The soldier did not snatch the child up in a panic, which would have torn a startled toddler screaming into the air right under the horse's head, and might have spooked the bay into the very plunge we were all terrified of. He stooped at the run, and he gathered, one long arm scooping low and wide around Davy's middle, and sweeping him up and back against the red wool of his chest, the other arm and the broad of his back already turning, already putting himself between my son and the horse, between my son and the wagon dropping down the slope, so that whatever was going to happen in the next second would happen to the soldier and not to the boy. He turned his own body into the wall. He made of himself the thing he had stood there pretending to be all morning, a thing that does not move, that takes the blow and holds. Except now he had a 2-year-old folded into the middle of it, and the whole of his discipline had reorganized itself in 3 seconds around the single task of keeping that child from harm. The near horse threw its head and shied. A big animal feels a low, fast thing come past its legs, and it does what nature built it to do. And for one terrible beat the wagon and the horses and the carter all flinched together, the boy at the heads hauling down, the carter standing up on the box and sawing the reins, the second wagon on the slope finally seeing, finally hauling its own team back so hard the load slewed. Krail said the foreleg came up and down a yard from where the soldier was turning, and the soldier did not flinch from it. He had already put his back to it. He took 2 driving steps out of the mouth of the road with my son's face buried against the metals on his chest. And then it was over, and there was a man in a red coat standing on the safe cobbles in the middle of a forecourt full of people who had all stopped breathing at the same time, holding my son. I have tried since to do honest justice to how fast it was, because the wrongest thing you could take from it is that there was a comfortable margin, that it was near but not really near. It was not near but not really near. Krail, who has worked with horses his whole life and is not a man given to drama, told me flatly that if the soldier had been 1 stride slower off the stone, or had wasted the half-second on a shout or a stumble or a snatch, he does not believe my son would be alive, and he said it looking at his own boots, the way men say a thing they wish were not true. The margin was the soldier. That is the only honest way I have found to put it. The wagon, the horses, the carter, the boy at the heads, none of them could have stopped what was coming, because none of them had a clear sight of the small thing under the chain until it was already in among the legs. The only line of defense between my son and the wheels was a man who was not supposed to leave a square of stone, and who left it, and who was fast enough and right enough and brave enough that the margin he made of his own body was the only margin there was. And here is the thing the film does not show, because the film starts when the running starts. Before the running, there is the watching. The soldier did not begin to react when my son came under the chain. He began to react before that. Krail was certain of it. In the seconds while Davy was still toddling across the open cobbles toward the swag, when no one alive would have called it an emergency yet, when it was just a small boy wandering a little wide of his people, the way small boys do at every gate every day of the year. The soldier had already gone quietly to a higher readiness. He had already weighted himself toward the road. He had run the whole thing forward in his mind before it happened, and decided what he would do, and where the horse's shoulder would be, and how he would take the boy in turn, so that when it stopped being a wandering child and became a child in the road, there was no decision left to make, no horror to climb up out of, only the executing of a plan already laid. That is why he was 3 seconds and not 5. The first 2 seconds had already been spent silently, while the rest of us were still talking. Then I got there. I do not remember the run. I am told I made a sound that people 3 rows back still talk about. I remember arriving, and the soldier was already lowering himself, not handing the boy off, but going down on 1 knee on the cobbles so that Davy came down with him, gently, the right way up, feet to the ground, the great gloved hand still steadying him by the shoulders so he would not topple. And I remember that my son was not crying. That is the thing the whole crowd remembers, the thing that turned the gasp into the strange, ringing silence. He was not crying. He had been swept up off the ground by a stranger taller than his whole world, a stranger in fur and brass, in the middle of horses and shouting, and he was not crying, because somewhere in those 3 seconds the man holding him had done something with his face and his arms and the low sound of his breath that told a frightened animal it was safe. I have thought about that more than anything. A man trained for years to show nothing, to be a wall, to wear a face like a shut door, and in 3 seconds, with a child in his arms, he found the other thing, the thing under the wall, and gave it to my son so completely that the boy did not even know he had been in danger. I went down on my knees on the cobbles in front of them. I could not speak. I got my hands on my son, and I could feel him whole and warm and indignant. He was indignant. He had wanted the horse, and I looked up at the soldier, and for just a moment before the wall came back, I saw his face. I am 51 years old. I have buried a father and a brother. I know what a man looks like when something has gone all the way through him. The soldier's face, in the half-second before he closed it, was the face of a man who had been somewhere very far away and very bad, and had just come back, and was not entirely sure yet that he had brought everyone with him. His jaw was set hard enough to ache. There was a brightness in his eyes that was not for show. He looked for that half-second, less like a statue than like a man who had just been allowed, after a long time, to do the one thing he had been waiting to be allowed to do. Then the wall came down over it, smooth as a blind drawn, and he was a soldier again, and he set my son very carefully and completely on his own 2 feet, and he stood up. His sergeant was there by then, a older, harder man who had come at a flat run from the gatehouse the instant the post emptied, and 2 more in plain clothes I had not known were among us, and there was the low, fast machinery of men who deal with sudden things for a living, the road being stopped properly now, the horses led off, the crowd being eased back. And in the middle of it the young soldier, I call him young. He was perhaps 30, but he was 20 years younger than me, and I will call him young, came back to a kind of attention, and I understood with a lurch that he was waiting to find out whether he was in trouble. Because he had left his post. Do you see? He had done the thing they spend years building him never to do. He had stepped off the stone and crossed the forecourt and put himself bodily into the working road, and for some number of seconds the gate he was sworn to had stood with no man on it. There is no asterisk in the rule. The rule does not say you may not leave your post unless a child is about to die. The rule says you may not leave your post. He had broken it with his whole body and his whole heart, in front of 100 phones, and now he stood and waited to be told what that would cost him, and his face gave away nothing at all. The sergeant stood in front of him for a long moment. I was close enough to hear. I have not told many people what the sergeant said, because it is the kind of thing that sounds invented, and it was not invented, and I will not have it sound like less than it was. The sergeant looked at the young soldier, and then he looked down at my son, who had toddled 2 steps back toward the horses already and been caught by the back of his little coat by my wife's mother. And the sergeant looked back at the soldier and said, very low, "You left your post, Hadwick." "Yes, Sergeant," the young soldier said. "You're going to be asked about that." "Yes, Sergeant." And the sergeant was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "What were you guarding?" I did not understand the question. I do not think the young soldier expected it either. Something moved behind his eyes. "The gate, Sergeant," he said. "No," the sergeant said. "What were you guarding?" And the young soldier did not answer, and the sergeant answered for him, in a voice meant only for the 2 of them and for me, who happened to be kneeling close enough to be inside it. "You were guarding people. The gate's a way of doing it. Don't ever let anybody teach you guard the stone instead of the people the stone is for. You'll write it up. You'll write every word of it. And if there's a man in this kingdom who will punish you for what you just did, I'll be standing next to you when he tries." He paused. "Now pick up your rifle, soldier, and go and stand your post, because the rest of these people still need guarding too." And the young soldier picked up his rifle from where it lay on the cobbles, and he wiped the grit from it with one motion of the white glove, and he walked back to the low stone, and he stood his post. He did not look at me. He did not look at the crowd or the phones. He came to attention facing the forecourt and the working road beyond it, and inside about 10 seconds you would not have known to look at him, that anything had happened at all, except that I knew now what the stillness was, and I would never again be able to unsee it. I tried to thank him. Of course I tried. When the worst of the shaking had gone out of my legs, I went and stood as near his post as the rope allowed, and I said his name, the name the sergeant had used, and I told him I was the boy's father and I would never in my life be able to repay what he had done. He did not turn his head. They are not permitted to. But I saw his throat move once, and after a moment, in a voice so low it was almost not a voice at all, pitched for me and no one else, he said, "He's not hurt." "No," I said. "No, thanks to you, he's not." "Then there's nothing to thank me for," the soldier said. "Go and mind your boy, sir." And then, after a pause, in the same low voice with the smallest possible change in it, "Hold his hand on the road." That is all he said to me. Hold his hand on the road. And I have, every day since, and I will until he is too big to let me, and then I will hold the next ones, because that is the only kind of thanks the man would take. I should have left it there. He wanted me to leave it there. But I am a father, and a father who has nearly lost a child cannot leave a thing like that alone. And so, over the months that followed, I did a thing I am only half proud of. I found out about him. Not to trouble him. Only because I could not bear that the kingdom should have a man like that in it and not know what it had. It was the foreman Crail who started me on it, and a quiet conversation with the sergeant, who would tell me nothing I could print but a few things I could keep. I will say plainly that the regiment did not make it easy, and I have come to respect them for that too. There was no parade made of it on their side. No officer sought me out to be photographed shaking my hand. When I wrote, in the careful weeks after, a long and clumsy letter of thanks meant for the soldier, it was returned to me not unkindly, but returned with a single line in another hand at the bottom, the sergeant's hand, I think, that said only, "He is glad the boy is well." We do not pass on thanks. He would not want them. I keep that letter. It is the only piece of paper I have from any of it, and it tells you everything about the kind of men they are, that the only words they would send me back were words that gently refused the very thing I was trying to give. So what I learned in pieces, from Crail and from the sergeant's few permitted scraps, and from one long evening with a retired color sergeant of the same regiment whom Crail knew, an old man who would talk a little more freely about the shape of such a life without ever naming a name. And what I learned was this. The young soldier's name was Hadwick. I will give him no more name than that, because he asked for none, and the regiment gives out no names, and I have come to think the no name is part of the honor and not a withholding of it. He had not always stood a palace gate. He had come to the forecourt the way I have since learned a certain kind of man comes to it, sideways, out of harder service. The ceremonial post given to a soldier the regiment judges has earned a measure of quiet. He had served before the gate, in places the sergeant would only call the bad weather years, and he had been in those years part of a thing whose whole purpose was reaching people in the worst few seconds of their lives, going into the water, into the fall, into the fire, into the place where the thing is already happening, and there is no time to send for help, and pulling the living out of it with their own two hands. He had done that for years. And then the sergeant said there had been a day, the sergeant would not tell me the day, and I did not ask twice, when he had reached a child 2 seconds too late. One child out of how many he had reached in time I will never know, and it was the one too late one he carried, the way these men always carry the one. He had asked after that for quiet duty. They had given him the gate. Do you understand what that means? Do you understand what it means that the man standing nearest the mouth of that road, the one man on the whole forecourt whose eyes were on the working way and not on the show, the one man built and trained and scarred for exactly the 3 seconds that came, was a man who had spent his whole life learning to cross the killing distance in time, and had been carrying for years the one time he had not. He was not a statue who happened to save my son. He was the most awake man on that forecourt, the only one of all of us who had been watching the right way, standing his quiet post with the whole of his terrible competence folded down small and held still inside the red coat, waiting, though I do not think even he would have put it this way, for the thing he had failed once to reach in time to come past his post again. And when it came, he did not fail it. He spent the post and the rule and whatever quiet they had given him along with the gate, and he crossed the distance, and this time he was not 2 seconds too late. This time he was exactly, precisely, to the half-stride in time. I think about the cost of that. I think people see the film, and there is film. There is always film now, and his 3 seconds have been watched by more people than will ever watch anything I do in my whole life, and they see a thrilling thing, a brave thing, a soldier breaking his famous stillness to snatch a baby from under a horse, and they are right, it is all of those. But I do not think most of them see what it cost him to be able to do it. It cost him the bad weather years. It cost him the day he would not name. It cost him the carrying. the reason he could read my son ducking under that chain in the time it takes to draw a breath, the reason he could solve in 3 silent seconds a thing the rest of us could not even finish being horrified by, is that he had paid, in advance and at a price I cannot imagine, for the skill of it. The stillness people photograph is not emptiness. It is a man holding an entire hard life perfectly level, so that on the one morning it is needed, it is all still there, all of it instantly with nothing spilled. There was an inquiry. Of course there was. He had left his post, and the rule is the rule, and a kingdom that lets soldiers leave their posts on feeling alone is a kingdom that will not hold. They were right to ask. The sergeant told me a little of it, and the rest I have pieced together. They put it to him plainly. He had abandoned a sworn post. What did he say for himself? And by all accounts he said almost nothing for himself. He did not plead the child. He did not say a clever thing. He answered when they pressed him for his reasoning in a few flat lines that I have asked to be allowed to keep and have been allowed, and that I will set down here exactly. There was a child in the road and a horse and a wagon coming. There was no time to call and be heard, and no other man placed to reach him. I judged that the duty the post exists to serve, and the duty to hold the post had come apart in that place for those few seconds, and that a man who held the stone and let the child die would have kept the lesser of them. I left the post. I would do the same again. If the rule cannot bear that, then I am wrong in the rule's eyes, and I will stand whatever that costs, but I will not say I would have stood still and let him die, because I would not have, and a man should not lie to an inquiry. They did not punish him. I am glad to be able to tell you that, because for months I dreaded the alternative, that the man who saved my son would be broken on a rule for saving him. The finding, as it was read, was that the post had not in truth been undefended, that the relief and the gatehouse had closed the gap within seconds, that no breach of the gate occurred or could have occurred in the time, and that the soldier's leaving of his post, while irregular, had served the very purpose for which the post is set, and was therefore not a failure of duty but, in the careful words they used, an exercise of it under a higher claim. They are clever, those careful words, and I have turned them over many times, and I think they are also true. He did not betray the post. He understood it better than the rule did. The sergeant had said the same thing in the forecourt in plainer words. You guard the people. The gate is only a way of doing it. The inquiry took longer to say it and said it in a colder voice, but it said the same thing, and it let him go back to his gate, and that is where he is to this day, as far as I know, standing the low stone by the mouth of the working road, watching the way the rest of us never watch, ready, because he is always ready. The old color sergeant told me one more thing that evening, near the end of it, when the bottle was low, and he had decided, I think, that I could be trusted with it. He said that the hardest posting in the regiment is not the cold one or the long one or the one where men shout in your face. The hardest posting, he said, is the quiet one given to a man who has been somewhere bad, because the quiet is supposed to be a kindness, a place to set the weight down, and instead it becomes the place where the man stands all day with nothing to do but hold the weight he has carried in. You give a man like that a soft gait, the old soldier said, thinking you're letting him rest. And what you're really doing is sitting him down in a quiet room with the thing he can't put down and asking him to keep his face still while he does it. The wonder of your soldier isn't that he moved. It's that he stood there every day before he moved. The moving's the easy part. The standing is the work. I have thought about that as much as anything anyone said to me in the whole long aftermath. Every dull morning the man called Hadwick stood that low stone and watched a road where nothing happened, holding the one morning something did inside him, ready and waiting and giving no sign, and the day it finally came, he was glad. You could see it in the half-second before the wall came down. He was glad. He had been given, at last, the chance to be in time. There is one more person I have to set down here, because he saw what I did not, and because he changed the way I have carried the whole of it, and that is a man I have never learned the name of, an older fellow who had been standing 2 places to my left at the rope with a grandchild of his own. He found me afterward while my legs were still bad, and he did a kind thing. He did not tell me how frightened I should have been. He told me very quietly that he had watched the soldier and not the horses the whole way through, because he had been a watchman of some sort in his own working years, and a part of him watches the watchers out of habit. And he told me the thing I have held onto hardest of all. He said that in all the years he had stood near such men, he had never once seen one move off a post, not for any provocation, not for any insult, not for any drunk or fool or famous man who tried to make a toy of them, and that he had come to believe, wrongly, that nothing on earth could move them, that the discipline had gone all the way down and left no man underneath. And then, he said, I watched one cross 40 feet of stone for a baby he'd never seen, faster than I've seen a young man move, and put a horse's hoof a foot from his own skull without so much as a blink, and I understood I'd had it backwards my whole life. It isn't that nothing can move them. It's that they've decided in advance and forever the one thing that will, and they've made everything else in the world unable to. He didn't break his discipline for your boy. He spent it on him. That's what it was saved up for. I have never forgotten that, the difference between a discipline broken and a discipline spent, and I have come to think it is the truest thing anyone said to me in the whole of that strange long year. The man called Hadwick had not failed to be a statue. He had been the most exact and terrible kind of statue. There is the kind that has been holding still its whole life precisely, so that, on the one day in 1,000 when stillness is the wrong thing, it can do the right thing faster and cleaner than any man who had been free to fidget all along. I have been back. I will not pretend I have not. We do not live in the city and we do not come often, but twice now on visits I have walked Davy up to the forecourt, holding his hand, you may be sure, the whole way on the road, and shown him the soldiers, and tried, in the clumsy way you try to tell a small boy a thing too big for him, to tell him what one of those red coats once did. He does not remember it. He was 2. He remembers nothing of the horses or the wagon or the man who put himself between my son and the end of everything. The whole event, for Davy, is a story his father tells, a thing that happened to a baby he cannot recall being. I used to find that unbearable, that the one whose life it was should be the one who does not remember it. I have made a kind of peace with it. I think it is, in its way, the cleanest measure of what the soldier did. The mark of how completely a thing is taken care of is that the one it was done for never even knows the size of it. My son walked away from his own death and was carried back from it and set on his feet, still wanting to pet the horse, and grew up sleeping soundly, and that untroubled sleep, that is the soldier's true monument, and it is invisible, and it is his, and he would not have it any other way. I do not know whether the man called Hadwick will ever read this or hear it read. I rather hope he does not, because I know now that he wants no part of being thanked, and that the wanting of no part is itself the deepest thing about him, the same root the rest of it grows from. He did not save my son for a film or a thank you or a finding read out in careful words. He saved my son because he had spent his whole life becoming a man who could, and because when the moment came he had decided long ago, in some place too deep for the rule to reach, which of his 2 duties was the higher one. He has never asked me for anything. He asked me for one thing only, in the lowest voice I have ever heard a man use, on the morning he gave me back my life: hold his hand on the road. So that is what I do, and that is what I am telling you to do, whoever you are, with whatever small warm hand is yours to hold. Hold it on the road. Watch the way the loud world doesn't. And if you ever find yourself near one of those still men in the red coats and the tall black fur, and you are tempted, as I once was, God forgive me, to think there is no person in there, only discipline poured into a uniform and stood up in the sun, I beg you to remember my son, who is 11 now and asleep down the hall, and who is alive because the stillest man on the forecourt was the only one awake. His hand left mine and I did not notice it go. But there was a man on that forecourt who had spent his whole life learning to notice exactly that, the small hand slipping free, the child stepping toward the place where the danger always is, and who had paid more than I will ever know for the noticing, and who, when it came, did not stand on the stone and let my boy die. He came off the stone, he crossed the distance. He was this time in time. There is nothing in this world I will not do to be worthy of having been the one whose son he caught, and the only thing he ever wanted in return I do every day. I hold the hand, I watch the road, and I tell people, every chance I get, exactly what one quiet man in a red coat did in 3 seconds on a bright morning, not so that they will praise him, because he does not want it, but so that the next father hearing it will hold on a little tighter and watch a little better, and perhaps spare himself the 11 seconds I will carry for the rest of my life. Hold his hand on the road. That is the whole of it. That is what he taught me, the man who would not be thanked. And I have never met anyone before or since who taught a larger thing in fewer words, or paid a higher price to be able to.